So tonight is our second lesson dealing with extra biblical sources, and I've been working on this and looking forward to it for some time, and I hope that you'll find it interesting. This past Wednesday night, I intended to provide a little bit of an introduction and some context because I really think context is very important in the historical record and consideration of that record. And among other things, I asked what I think to be the really important question behind this whole series: why study extra biblical sources? And so among the reasons that could be given, I offered these. Although the Bible is self-authoritative, extra-biblical sources may be seen to reaffirm the text by echoing and reinforcing historical details, by informing us further about relevant cultural beliefs and practices, complementing and supplementing the historical record with details and elements that are not given us in the biblical account, and frankly, it just constitutes a fascinating study in its own right. So that's my bit of recap. And boy, you can't make that out at all. I thought about putting my schedule out there, but I hate waste. And you dear-hearted people don't take the papers as I would like. I've made jokes about having to wallpaper a room in my house with my unused handouts, and I'm not far from that. I still have a lot of them from the last 3 years. So I decided that I would not do that this time, which goes against my grain because I do love handouts as a teacher, and I do love them as a student as well. But you're not going to get any handouts unless you ask me. I can't make that out at all myself. But I do know, Brother Dutch, that it ends in April. I think April the 29th. So not uncommonly for me, I got my tongue tangled and was saying that I was going to end this in March. Brother Dutch pointed out, that's next month. And yeah, I'd planned a lot more than that. So I don't know where that came from. Part of the spaghetti that is my brain. But in any case, if you can make that out, historians are tonight. March the 11th, I'm going to have to scratch. I think I'm going to need another night, Brother Dutch. We've already discussed this. Because one of our missionaries, Franco Verardi, is going to be visiting us. In the past, when he's done it, it's always been on a Sunday. And I frankly regret that he's coming on a Wednesday, not because of my class, but because he would have a larger number of people to give his report to. He doesn't speak English, but he's a wonderful man, very warm-hearted, an excellent worker in the kingdom. If you haven't encountered him and heard him speak through a translator, then I would encourage you, be sure to be here for March the 11th. In my communication with him, because I'm the liaison for Brother Franco in our missions committee, I said, well, I think I know the teacher, and I think he'll let you have Wednesday night, the 11th. that was a joke. And so I'm going to give that up, and he'll do a great job, a better job that night than I would have done. But in any case, returning to my context, because I didn't quite finish my material last time. I got about 2/3 of the way through it. And that's the story of my life. It's a domino effect, you see. Just a little bit not there, a little bit more not there, and so it goes. But we're going to do what we can to hit the highlights on this contextual information. Again, I think it important, or I would not spend the time. And then we're going to be focused on mainly 4 great historians that serve as wonderful extra-biblical sources. And they are Suetonius and Tacitus, pagan Roman historians. And then the major Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus. And then I'm hoping to conclude with another Roman, Pliny the Younger, and see what these men have to say about Christ, about his church, and about how it fared during this time, which was a time of real persecution, as we know from the epistles of Paul, as well as many other sources. So, one of the things that I did last time by way of setting the stage contextually was I tried to sketch out for all of us the the providential growth of the Roman Empire. And I truly think this was God at work. We know that God uses vessels of honor and of dishonor. It doesn't matter if you are for him or against him, he will use you. So why not be for him and receive his blessings and his grace, because you will be used. And he uses individuals and he uses nations. And I'm convinced that this was, again, providential. So this is Rome at the height of its greatest extent, about AD 112, during the reign of the Emperor Trajan in the so-called High Imperial period, also known as the time of the 5 good emperors. And we use that word good in context with the rest of the Roman emperors. They were pagans. Trajan was the second of these 5, but they're so noted as being good emperors because they were good administrators. On the whole, they were just, and they helped Rome in very positive ways. And I mentioned a little bit more about Trajan because it was during his rule that the empire made its final steps of growth. And if we get to Pliny, as I'm hoping we will, there's some fascinating correspondence between Pliny the Younger, who is serving as a governor in part of the Roman world, to the Emperor Trajan, this very man. So, in the middle of the Italian peninsula, there is Rome, the capital. And incidentally, I sort of scavenged this from last spring when I taught the class on Paul's epistle to the Romans. And so some of you may have been part of that. I know we've all slept since then, so I'm hoping that this doesn't seem like I'm just, refurbishing, but I am. And so this was an image that I used for that class as a backdrop for Rome, the capital, again, to provide context for that series of lessons, but very, very applicable to this one as well. So right there in the middle of that image is the famous Flavian Amphitheater, the Colosseum, which was erected by the Flavian emperors who preceded the High Imperial 5 good emperors, and one of the landmarks of the world. You look at that thing and you think immediately Rome, even if you've never been there. I think we all recognize and understand that. So Rome, as an empire, not now the capital, was approximately 60 million people that the Romans ruled over. And slavery being common, about 15% of the Roman world, about 40%, I'm not good with percentages, let me drop that. About 15 million of these were slaves. So, wow, that should be sobering. In Rome, the city, approximately 1 million at its height, around 30 to 40% of that 1 million were slaves. You had to be really poor to not be able to afford a slave. They were just so common, and many people had several. And Rome, as with America today, was a racial, ethnic, and religious melting pot. I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome, and that's true. It seemed like this was the nexus of power, also of culture, and many of the cynical Romans of the day basically said every poisonous thing winds up in Rome. And among those quote-unquote poisonous things were all of the diverse religions and faiths and belief systems of the enormous Roman Empire, including Christianity, which the cynic would associate with poisonous things. And home to a thriving Jewish community. And that has both good and not so good connotations. So I used this last spring as well because once more I thought that this was very appropriate as regards setting the context. This is one of my favorite history painters in Western art. Jean-Léon Gérôme painted in 1852-53 this painting, The Age of Augustus, the Birth of Christ. And at the very height of the painting, here he is here, or over here. Every time somebody uses a pointer in this setting, I never know which screen to look at, so I gave you both. That's Augustus. And the idea is that by worldly standards, oh, he's the great man. He's the great ruler of his time. And indeed, in worldly, earthly sense, he was. But the real thing that's important, oh, and by the way, down below him, we have slaves and we have workers, and just a little below him are the ruling elite, the consuls and the senators and the powerful people, the power brokers. But he's at the height of all of it. And at the very bottom of the whole thing, hold that thought. I'll get back to it. So this was an amazing man. I think he may have been providentially prepared for his role too. Here's a bust of him as Octavian. He was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. And when Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Octavian, the grandnephew, was just about to begin his obligatory military assignment. His granduncle had achieved the height of political power in Rome as the dictator. And we hear that today, and we think about Mussolini and fascism and Hitler and so forth. All of this comes from the Roman world, and it did not have the opprobrium, the negativity that World War II produced. A dictator was a respectable, indeed praiseworthy office in the Roman world. In the Republic, which we're talking about the waning days of the Republic here in the 1st century BC, you had 2 chief executives, and they were elected annually. And we've all been through many election cycles. Can you imagine Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump sharing power? Or Joe Biden and Donald Trump sharing power? Or Kamala Harris and anybody with Donald Trump sharing power? Can you imagine that? That's the way it was in the Roman world. And it wasn't every 4 years, it was every year. Every year. And just as with our system, quite often the two who led the polls were opponents politically. And this is one reason why they shared office and they alternated. So they wouldn't constantly be scotching, vetoing one another, for want of a better way of putting it. So this was a cumbersome system, and it had begun to break down, in fact, long before Caesar. And so when he seized power, he named himself dictator, which again was an admirable office. It allowed someone in a time of true state emergency to take the reins of government and to rule alone. And nothing you did in power during that emergency time could you be prosecuted for. You could do anything, including take the lives of citizens, because you were doing what you were doing for the good of the state. And the Senate, who had put you in that position, trusted you so much that they believed you would do the right thing. Granted, Caesar wasn't the typical dictator, and to some extent, he placed himself in that position. This is one reason why his opponents in the Senate assassinated him in the Senate House in 44 BC, because he had pushed the system too far. But he recognized that the Roman world was, the Republic at least, was unraveling. It wouldn't work. The empire had become too big for this two-man rule elected annually, a system that was devised to govern a city-state, not a sprawling empire. And so Caesar was trying to figure out, and no doubt he would have achieved it, he was a supremely intelligent man, an alternative to king on the one hand, the Romans hated kings, and the twin consulship of the Republic with its annual elections. And he died before he managed to figure out how to do that. How do you find a balance between these two opposites? Well, Octavian, as I've said, was poised to start his military career. Any man of birth had to serve in the military to achieve anything politically. Octavian was the grandnephew of the greatest man of the time. He was 19. He hears that Caesar's been assassinated. He hurries back to Rome to see what's going to happen next. And there, probably as much to his surprise as to anyone's, he finds in the reading of Caesar's will that he, Octavian, has been named Caesar's heir. So now he is the son of Julius Caesar, and with that, the heir to the great wealth, and more importantly, the popularity that Caesar held with the Roman troops. So just like that, he becomes an extremely powerful man, even though he's only 19. And surrounded by many older, much more experienced men who are eager and willing to take the reins of authority now that Caesar's gone. Well, one by one, he allies and then defeats them. And at the end of this, about 3129 BC, he's the only man standing, the only one of any note. And I'm sure you've heard of Mark Antony and his liaison with Cleopatra, and that pair are very famous. These were among the last that he originally had allied with Antony and then defeated because Antony revolted against Rome and Rome's power. Well, all of that to say that this man did what his grand uncle and adopted father had probably aspired to do. He developed a new system. He called himself princeps, from which we get our word prince. But it had no royal connotations at that time. It just meant that this is the first man. I've often heard it described as first among equals, which is an oxymoron. How do you have a first among equals? That's a self-defeating concept. But he was walking a very tight line because the Romans hated kings. Autocracy was not the thing for the Roman world, and that's why the Republic was born. And yet he had to lead, and someone had to do it effectively. Again, the Republic was dying. It was effectively dead when Caesar lay on the floor of the Senate in 44 BC. So he ruled as the sole ruler. He still kept the vestiges of government, the consulate, which was the chief office, the highest office of the Republic, going. It would continue on throughout Rome's history. But now there was a princeps, the first man, an imperator, from which we get our word emperor. And that man between 31 BC, AD 14 was this man. The Senate gratefully called him the August One. Augustus is really a title. It's not a name. And our own 8th month of the year is named after this guy, Augustus. So he was an important figure. Unlike all of the people who had been before him, his goal was to establish peace. And here's where I think the providence comes into play, because it's during his rule that Christ is born in Bethlehem of Judea. And throughout his rule, he strove to establish and maintain peace throughout the Roman world. And initially this was called the Pax Augusti, but after him it continued on. It's called the Pax Romanum, the Roman peace. And if you're thinking I'm just indulging my interest in history and you're a captive audience, you sort of are. But there is a point to this, because there were prophecies about a savior of mankind. that were leading up to Christ. And they weren't just Jewish. There were pagan prophetesses who were telling the people of the Roman world a Savior is coming who will redeem all of humanity. And this is exactly what Jerome is plugging into. Because Augustus, no doubt, thought he was the man. And the irony is that it was that little group down at the bottom of Jerome's painting. That's the nativity scene, if you hadn't recognized it. We'll go there in a moment. So, wow, I need long view spectacles. Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 through 5. But when the fulfillment of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. And so Paul here talks about when the fulfillment of the time was come, when the time was right. And I've used this before. I'm using it again. I will tell all of you, as I have done before, this particular sequence of ideas comes from Jimmy Allen. And I appreciate the way he put it together, the succinct nature of these thoughts. I think they're right on. And so this is how Brother Allen did this back in the day. All are guilty of sin. And all are helpless in the face of sin before the throne of God. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So there's the need. And then we have the Jewish diaspora, both the kingdom of Israel and of Judah under the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians are taken out of their comfort zone, we might say today. That's a very light way to speak about, to some extent, genocide, the killing of a culture, the dispersion of a people. There was a lot of violence and evil that occurred, particularly under the Assyrians. But the important thing is that Jewish people with the Mosaical law were seeded all over the ancient world. And in consequence of this, there were communities all over the ancient world that were ripe for the teaching and the message of the Christ. And then we have the Greek language. The Greek language is universal, thanks to the conquests of Alexander the Great. Koine Greek is dispersed all over the West and into that part of the world that we today call the Middle East. And I am not a Greek speaker, but I'm told it's one of the most fluent, eloquent languages there is. The ruling elite, the Romans, knew Greek. It wasn't just the people out in the hinterland, the backwoods of the eastern part of the empire. It was all over the empire. It was the language of intellectuals. And then we have Brother Allen's number 4, Romans ruled the world. So from 31 BC, with the establishment of the Pax Augusti, the Augustan peace, we have peace, which makes it possible for missionaries like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, and so many, many others to go and spread the word, share the word, the gospel. We have Roman roads, which were approximately 250,000 miles of roads, the best the ancient world had to offer. And, 250,000 roads, almost 50,000 miles of paved roads, which of course obviously facilitated travel. And so Brother Allen concluded all of these thoughts by saying, time for fulfillment of kingdom prophecy, and cites Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, and Mark chapter 1, verse 15. So all of that to say that the time is right, and in God's provision, the Christ is born at that right time. I think all of these points are right on. And so let's go back again to Jerome's painting, and if you didn't notice earlier, let me help you. At the foot of all of this are Mary and Joseph and the Christ child. in the humble context of this painting, which really is intended to laud the great ruler of the time, but in reality, the great ruler, the Messiah, is the little baby. And isn't that so much like God's paradoxical wisdom? He humbles the proud, and he uplifts those who are downtrodden. Well, that is my conclusion of my contextual information, and we still have about 30 minutes. About 30 minutes. So this is the lead-in image for officially the second of our classes. Ecclesiastes 12:12, and further, my son, be admonished by these of making many books, there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh. If you were here this last Sunday, I was a little surprised. I did, in fact, share that statement with Brother Nathan. He had called asking about Vasily Kandinsky, the Russian painter, and we were talking about that and other matters. It became apparent to me that I was going on too long, because abruptly he said, "Oh, that's my wife, I've got to go. I'll see you later." He didn't offer to call back. And he even said up there that they'll talk more about these things than you may have the patience to hear. Oops. I knew I was going on too long. But in any case, I did share with him what I thought was an old common graduate school thing. You learn more and more about less and less as a graduate student until finally you know everything about nothing. And I guess that's the graduate student's wisdom in conjunction with Ecclesiastes. You know, there's no end to it. It just keeps going. And yet there has to be an end, a reasonable end. So to help us to focus, I've already shared the entire list with you. Although, as I've said, this is a work in progress. I might add or detract one or two. So here are the historians that I'm planning on treating. And tonight, I was hoping to give you just a little bit of those first four: Suetonius, Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny the Younger. And so just to formally introduce you to them, when I teach in my art history classes, I always like to have a self-portrait, if there is one available for an artist, or a portrait. And I do this with historians, patrons, other major figures, because I like to humanize these people. When I was a kid and I thought about the great artists, I was like, whoa! You know, they just were so huge and tremendous. I could not imagine them bearing the stamp that God gave me and being common people. It was just all but unthinkable. And so even as a kid, I like to look into the lives of great artists, and I like to see portraits and self-portraits. I still feel that way today. So it's a bit more challenging the further back we go. I will tell you quite honestly, no one is quite sure if this is truly a bust representing Suetonius. I'm confident that whoever made that black and white image of Tacitus, that he looked probably nothing like that. But these are the images that you're going to typically find when you go online to represent these. So just take them as they are. They're just faces that help us to put a human impress upon these names and the people, the real people who wrote these books and created these works. And then there's Josephus. And that one, yeah, you're going to find that one identified as Josephus. And it might surprise you because he's Jewish. And you might be thinking he should have a big long beard and maybe a turban and whatnot. This one is questionable, as were the other two. But this is as good as anything, and I think it very likely could be Josephus. Certainly scholar Mark Eisler believed that it was, and this is the scholar who attached the name Flavius Josephus to this bust. But in any case, just know that these are just images that may or may not represent the real person, and they at least give us a sense of the humanity of these people who are so famous because of their abilities, their contributions as historians. So I want you to note this little blurb here before we go on. Although these authors, Josephus, Suetonius, Tacitus, do not provide biographical details about the life of Jesus. The writings of these three, Suetonius, Tacitus, Josephus, are among the few early non-Christian Roman-era authors who mention Jesus and the existence of Christians. So in my book, for my purposes in this class, these historians are the big ones, these three, because they provide us extra biblical reinforcement of what we're told in the Gospels, and yet they do it from a non-Christian point of view. Frankly, Tacitus and Suetonius were pagans. They believed in the gods, if they believed in anything, and Josephus was a Jew. But still, in corroborating what we read, I think they're really interesting, and they offer some really good insights. The fourth of these that I'm hoping to deal with tonight is Pliny the Younger, another Roman, another pagan. And I've already told you that he worked under the time of the Emperor Trajan in the High Imperial period. It was actually in conjunction with persecution that Pliny wrote the emperor and frankly asked, how do I treat these people? Should I kill them? He's just about that blunt. Or should I grant them leniency? He wanted to know what to do from the emperor. Okay, so I've introduced the four, so let me share with you just a little bit about them and specifically focus in on the relevant texts that they've left us. And it's just little snippets here and there. Well, for the most part, Josephus and Pliny, I've got a lot more for them. Okay, so Suetonius, we know very little about this man. Almost nothing about his life. It's believed that he is born in the year 69, which in the Roman historical calendar is the notorious year of the four emperors. More about that later. So I just said that. So he served as secretary to the Emperor Hadrian. Now Hadrian was the successor of Trajan. So Hadrian is another one of the so-called five good emperors. If you have visited or know of the Pantheon, this amazing dome structure in Rome, Hadrian was the patron of that building. It's one of the most amazing buildings of the ancient Roman world, the best surviving Roman structure that has come down to us. And so in his capacity as the secretary for the emperor, he had access to imperial archives. Every government has an archive system where they keep the papers or the tablets or whatever it might be. And that's as true for Washington, D.C. and the White House as it's true for Rome in the first century, as it's true for the ancient Assyrians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians. And so what's important about this is this man had the inside knowledge. He found a lot of things that if he had not recorded them, would surely have been lost to us. Good things, shameful things, terrible things. He authored several books, but the only one that has come down to us in its entirety is the famous 12 Caesars, which begins with Julius Caesar, although he was not an emperor. He was the great dictator at the end of the Republic, continues with Augustus and onward. So here's my Penguin Classics edition of the 12 Caesars. I first read this, I think when I was, it doesn't matter, but it must have been when I was in my early 20s, and I was fascinated, appalled, horrified. If you want to learn more about the iniquity of Rome, read the 12 Caesars, because Suetonius gives it to you unvarnished. And so with that in mind, I just want to share just a little bit with you about the people who followed Augustus. Tiberius Nero, or rather Claudius Nero Tiberius, is known as Tiberius. He was the adopted son and the successor of Augustus. He began his reign at the time of the death of Augustus in AD 14. Initially, he was a good administrator. People liked him. But as time went by, he became more paranoid. He removed himself from Rome. He lived in southern Italy off the coast on the island of Capri, which is a delightful, beautiful place. If you ever go there, you'll never wonder why he moved to Capri. And there, isolated, he grew even more paranoid, and he began a reign of terror. The last few years of his life, he executed people here, there, and yonder terribly, and this is so true in the case of despots and autocrats. Many of his victims were those closest to him, including his own family members, who he feared would supplant him. And I'm not going to go into the really seamy details, but this man was a wicked man, and he did wicked things that became notorious. His successor was the notorious Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, who is known in history by the nickname Caligula, the little boot, because his father, who was the nephew of Tiberius, Caligula was the grandnephew of Tiberius. His father, Germanicus, was placed on the German frontiers, an excellent soldier, general, leader of men. And in that capacity, the little boy was dressed up like a Roman legionnaire, including little Roman hobnail boots, little soldier boots. And so affectionately, the troops began to call him Caligula, Little Boot. And that's the name by which history knows him. Well, he was frankly depraved. I don't know of any other way to put it. Suetonius tells us that shortly after he came to power, he suffered a life-threatening illness. And Suetonius dramatically goes from, I've told you about the emperor, now I must tell you about the madman. And he does all kinds of crazy things. He may have killed Tiberius. Tiberius saw that there was a vicious streak in him, and he famously said, I am nursing a viper for the Roman world. And there at Capri, Caligula was indulged in all of the vices that his old granduncle had already begun to really develop and to indulge himself in. And when Tiberius lies dying on his couch in Capri, and then Caligula is told he's dead, he goes out to receive the accolades of the gathered senators and the well-to-do. And then Suetonius says, a chamberlain comes up and says, oh, the emperor has revived. Oops, what do you do with that? So Suetonius says he went back and he smothered Tiberius. So he's very likely guilty of having murdered Tiberius. But in any case, he starts off his reign well, just like Tiberius did, and then he goes south really quickly. He does crazy things. He throws money and other gifts down to the crowd because in the arenas of gladiatorial combats, because he likes to see people fight for the money and the gifts that he's giving. He names his horse Incutatus, a senator, probably in contempt of the senatorial class, and he thought the horse would do just as well as any of those men. He wanted a great military reputation, but he was a coward. And so he took a picked legion of men, and he went out to the seashore, and he said, attack the sea. They're supposed to fight the sea. And you can imagine a bunch of burly soldiers flailing away with their swords at the sea. And then he says, gather spoils, seaweed and shells and things like this. He was crazy. On one occasion, he got so angry with the people in the arenas, the amphitheater where people watched the gladiatorial combats. Apparently, they had cheered for the wrong person. And he says, I wish I could kill you all myself. And he would have done it if he could have. Well, he was assassinated after just a handful of years. He ruled from AD 37 to 41. He also called himself God and wore a beard and claimed that he was Jove, the supreme god, being Jupiter of the Roman pantheon. He was succeeded by his granduncle. No, not by his granduncle, his uncle proper. So Tiberius Claudius Nero Germanicus was the uncle proper of Caligula and the nephew of Tiberius. You may wonder, well, why didn't this man step into Tiberius' shoes? Well, he didn't, because everybody thought he was crazy. Claudius was a problem. Everybody in the family was ashamed of him. His own mother said he was a monster, half made and thrown into the world. He slobbered, he drooled and slobbered when he got excited. He had a nervous tic, he stuttered. Everybody thought he was an idiot. He was an embarrassment to the family who were ruling Rome. He was kept in the shadows. He claimed in afterlife that a lot of this was just acting, so he wouldn't become a victim of his own family. And that's very likely true, because he proved to be highly intelligent. He was a scholar. He wrote many histories. Yes, he had those tics and the drooling and other problems, but he was a highly intelligent man and ruled very well. One of the good Julio-Claudian rulers. But unfortunately, he liked women, and he married 3 times, and they were unfaithful to him, and the third one was Caligula's sister. There had to be a law passed in order to allow the uncle to marry the niece, and she was ambitious for her son, and they conspired to kill Uncle Claudius. And that led to Nero. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, known as Nero, is another Caligula. Power-mad, evil man. He was the one who began the persecution of the Christians, the first great persecution that took place after the fire of Rome in AD 63. And everything in Nero's world revolved around Nero. He was the only important thing there was, and did all kinds of cruel and evil things. Caligula and Nero really celebrated, rejoiced in violence. On one occasion, Caligula had some senators over in the palace, and they were eating and talking, and all of a sudden Caligula started laughing. And the senator said, "What are you laughing at?" And he said, "I'm just thinking I could have you all killed like that." That's the way Caligula was. Nero was similar. He would actually get a bunch of ruffians and disguise himself and go through the streets of Rome in the night, robbing people. He thought it was fun. And he was crazy too. So I mention all of this because this is the typical stuff of Suetonius. And I'm reminded here of what Paul says in Ephesians 5:11 through 12. When he's talking about wicked, evil people, he says, "Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of these things which are done by them in secret." And I'm thinking that God may have inspired him to say this in part because of the shameful things that these people did. And who were these people? They were the rulers of the known world at that time. And as the ruler goes, so do the people. This was a corrupt, lawless time. If you despair about America, read Suetonius. You will feel encouraged. Things are not the way they should be, let there be no doubt. But we're not ruled by murderers and madmen. And I thank God for that. So what does Suetonius have to say about Christians? Well, not a lot, and yet the little that he does say is interesting. It is insightful. So there are a couple of passages in the 12 Caesars that speak about Christ and Christianity. Really the latter more than the former. So the so-called Christus passage reads, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, he, Claudius," this is from the life of Claudius, "he expelled them from Rome." And so we can understand this because all you have to do is read Acts and recognize that everywhere Paul went, trouble followed. Because he would go to the Jews first, some would accept the gospel, others would be fearful, they would be jealous of their hold on God, their belief in God, they would accuse Paul of all kinds of terrible things, and then controversies and mobs and riots would typically follow. And so if you are with me here on this, then you know that this is mentioned actually in Acts. Acts 18 verse 2, we're told that Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome. This is why he did it, because the Jews were considered to be too troublesome, and Rome was already had enough of its own trouble. And among those expelled were Aquila and Priscilla, the co-workers with Paul. So hopefully you're remembering the passage that I'm referring to, again, Acts 18 verse 2. And then there's the Christian passage, where we read during his reign, this is the reign of Nero, many abuses were severely punished and put down. This is a passage where Suetonius is talking about the so-called good things that Nero did in really righting wrongs and correcting the laws and again, so-called good things. Remember, this is a pagan speaking. And so he said punishment was effected on the Christians, a class of men, he says, given to a new and mischievous superstition. So that's the viewpoint of a pagan. Christians are mischievous. They get into trouble. Well, that's pretty much it for Suetonius. And as I've told you, it's just snippets here and there. Tacitus, I'm going to share with you part of what Tacitus says is in his annals. He was a contemporary with Suetonius. Not much is known about him either. Much of his annals really repeat and reinforce, and on occasion give further insights into the very same things that Suetonius has written about. So they're really an interesting pair to read together. And of his works that have survived, the Annals is the best known. And there is really the cover from the Loeb Classics edition of the Annals, which has the original Latin and the translation. And so here is the important section that Tacitus gives us. And we read, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abomination. The context here is the Great Fire of Rome that took place in AD, I think I said 63 a few moments ago, 64. This was such a terrible fire that it burned for, I think, a week. And no telling how many thousands of people lost their lives. The center of Rome was burned out. And Nero took advantage of this. As I've said, in Nero's world, everything revolved around Nero. He took advantage of this to build an enormous, luxurious palace, which was called the Golden House, the Domus Aurea. It went on, the construction for years. It kept expanding and growing. And when it was finally finished, shortly before he lost his popularity and was named an enemy of the state by the Senate and fled and subsequently committed suicide, shortly before all of that, when it was finished, he said, at last, now I can live like a human being. And that in the face of the suffering and the loss of life that made possible this enormous palace. And so not surprisingly, as this thing was being built and was growing and spreading, the victims, the people of Rome, began to think, maybe he started the fire in the first place to do this very thing. And we all know about publicity ratings. You got to have them if you want to stay in power. There's nothing new about that. And so Nero's publicity ratings started to plummet, and they kept going down and down. And that's what Tacitus is saying. He fastened the guilt. He began to hear that he was being blamed for the fire. And honestly, no serious historian believes that he did it, but he was blamed for it. And so he decided instead to put the guilt, as Tacitus says, on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty. Christus, Christ, was killed during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our, I think it's hard to make, procurators. In point of fact, he was a prefect, and some scholars wonder about that misnomer. Pontius Pilate, he names him by name. And most mischievous superstition, then checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where, this is one of the cynics I was telling you about, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So Tacitus, from the pagan perspective, labels Christianity as hideous and shameful. Well, the third of these great non-Christian historians is Josephus. And here you have the frontispiece with a so-called portrait of Josephus that is in one of the very old editions of his complete works. And that image is based on this image, which was an engraving that was made by John Sartain in 1880. He knew no more about what Josephus looks like than I do. But he thought that he was a Jew. He must have a big beard and a turban. Well, Josephus took the Flavian Roman name because he was a client of Vespasian and of Titus, who became emperors in their own right. Their family name was Flavius. So he took that name. He was a Romanized Jew. And I think it could well be that this bust is as good a representation of Josephus as this fantasy that John Sartain made in the 1880s or 90s. So that's the one that I opted to use, and I've got a lot more to share with you about Josephus than we have the time to do, because it's already time to stop. And you may be thinking, hallelujah. But I'm just getting started. I'm just enjoying myself. That's the way it always is. I'm getting into it, and then I got to stop. So hopefully I haven't put anybody off, and you'll be back with us next Wednesday, because I want to continue with Josephus. He's a major figure in our material, and deal with Pliny the Younger. You'll find that, I think, very fascinating as he's inquiring about what should he do with these Christian people. And then we're going to deal with a couple of three others, and then we're going to be dealing with the early church fathers. That's the goal. So let's have a prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Thank you, Father, for the day that you blessed us with. Thank you for the rich things that are out there for us to learn as we learn and grow. Learning is a lifelong pursuit, and whether we're actively engaged in it or not, we are learning. And I pray that you might help us to develop a hunger for learning, not only from these kinds of materials, but from your word. We thank you for your word and the way it lights our paths and governs our steps. I pray that you would help us to be the people, the men and the women that you've called us to be, not only collectively as a church body, doing the good things within this community and through our contributions to missions abroad around the world, but also as individuals, as we reach out to those in need, as we comfort those who are suffering and are in need of comfort from grief, as we minister to those who are at our very elbows and whose needs may be within our ability to relieve. I pray, as Eric has done, for all those members of our own body who are in need of encouragement and healing, particularly Brother Duncan and Steve Moore, those who are struggling with grief, particularly the Shaw family. I pray that you would encourage and bless them and the Spears family. I pray that you would, again, help us to be your people, your light, your salt, your leaven in this world. Thank you for the time that you give us. Help us to count our days and to make the most of them. As we face the remainder of this week, I pray that you would bless us in these pursuits that I've mentioned. I pray that you would continue to give us the good things that you've given us. We are very blessed as a people. And I pray that through that blessing we can bless others. Most of all, we thank you for Christ. It's in his name that I pray.